Drogan Level 5 Upgrade. Hello everybody, today we have yet another Rit Dyeing session. So this time around I'm doing Drogan. There's a couple parts on him: chassis, bell crank, servo saver, and shocks, and transmission case. So 6 things instead of the 1 from Velocity. So let's move on and take a look. To start things off, I'm going to be removing the upper deck, and it's held on with 4 screws. Now the 4 screws removed of the upper deck, we just need to remove the screws that hold the toe links to the bell cranks, and they are on both sides. With the toe links removed, we can now pull the upper deck right on off without having to worry about it being connected to the front suspension. Now what we're going to need to do is remove these 2 screws that hold the bell cranks on, as well as the screw that holds the servo saver on, the 2 screws that hold the link together, as well as the 2 screws that hold the bell crank links to their link. We're also going to be removing the 3 screws that hold the bulkhead to the chassis. Next I'm going to be removing the waterproof receiver box, and it's held on with 2 screws. Next I'm going to be removing the ESC, and all I have to do is disconnect the motor from it, just like that, and unscrew the 2 screws that hold it in place. Next I'm going to remove the ESC plate, and it's held on with 4 screws. Next I'm going to remove the shock tower, and it's held on with 4 screws. Next I'm going to unscrew the 6 screws that hold the transmission to the chassis. Next I'm going to unscrew the 2 kingpins that hold the rear A-arms in place. Now we're going to remove the rear bumper mount. It's held on with 5 screws. 2 on this side, and then 3 on this side. Next I'm going to remove the drive shafts, and each one are held on with a single grub screw. Next we remove the gear cover, and it's held on with a single screw. Unless you have the stock wheelie bar mount or you don't have a wheelie bar, then it's held on with 2, and it's going to be the second one. It's going to be right here. With the gear cover out of the way, we can now take apart the slipper clutch assembly and the pinion gear. The pinion gear is held on with a single grub screw right there, and you can just unscrew this 7mm nut, and the rest will come off. With the nut out of the way, we can start taking the slipper clutch assembly apart, and it's simply as just taking one piece off at a time. Just want to make sure you put them on back in the right order, and then you also don't want to lose this little bar down here. This is very important. There we go. And now you can also remove the 2 screws that hold the motor in place. With everything off the transmission, now we can finally take it apart, and it's held on with the remaining 5 screws. Now that we have the transmission case opened up, we can now take all the gears out. We have the differential gear. Going to be cleaning these all up before reinstallation. We got the idler gear, and the drive gear. Now what we need to do is take out all the ball bearings that are in the case. Got one right here. The last thing we need to do to Drogan is to remove the front and rear shocks, and those are simply held on with 2 screws. Now the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to disassemble the shocks so that we can dye the bodies. Now it's easily done. First, take out the retainer, the spring, upper retainer, and any spacer we have. I'm going to take an end of my screwdriver, hold the body, and untie the cap, just like that. Remove the bladder. Oop. Gonna bring over my Mountain Dew. You guys can't really see it, but I'm emptying it out into the bottle. You guys can see it. Alright. With that emptied out, sorry you guys don't get to see that part. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some pliers. I'm going to grip the rods and unscrew the ends. There we go. Alright, with the ends unscrewed, we can push the rod through. Gonna unscrew the bottom. Take the end of the rod so we can get the seals out. Should be one more in there. Just like that. Alright, and now the shock body is ready for dyeing. Alright guys, so here's all the parts I'm going to be dyeing on Drogan. I got the chassis, I got the shock bodies, battery strap, servo horn, saber, not horn. Alright guys, this is everything I'm going to be dyeing on Drogan. I got the chassis, shock bodies, the wire tie, transmission cases, bell cranks, and servo saver. So guys, it's going to be a long night, that's for sure. And this is before. And here you have them guys, all the parts dyed and looking pretty. As you guys can see, everything got dyed nice and black. The transmission case, shock bodies. The only thing that didn't come out nice, and this goes for all of the parts across all my RCs that I've done, is the servo savers and the bell cranks. The plastic just a little too dense for it to take completely, but it gave them this really cool, I wouldn't say metallic kind of look, but it's just really cool how in areas it's a lot darker, and in the more thicker areas it's a little more lighter, but it just the look of it just looks kind of cool. So I like them. So I'm going to keep them the way they are. I'm not going to try and replace them. I'm not going to try and paint them. I'm just going to keep them the way they are. So with that said guys, let's move on to rebuilding the transmission. Alright, here is Drogan's Magnum Traxxas transmission. As you guys can see, the dye took pretty well on these parts, and even the internal parts did well. Some areas there was a little bit of grease left over, and it didn't take all that too well, but you're not going to see that. So putting this thing back together is pretty simple. I love the simplicity of the Magnum transmissions. All you gotta do is pop the bearings back in place, just like this, on both halves. With the bearings in place, now we can start putting in the gears. Starting with the drive gear, all we need to do is slide 2 Teflon washers, one on each end of the gear, and then we can just drop it in place. It's going to go up to the very top hole right there. Then we also have our idler gear. But before we can put that in place, we're going to need to take this little rod, slide it into place right there for the middle gear, and then we're going to take 1 Teflon washer, slide it on just like that. Then we're going to take our gear, which has 2 ball bearings inside of it already, slide it into place, and then take another Teflon washer, put it on the end. We can finally take our differential gear, which we should just be able to slide into place, just like that. Then we're going to put a nice good coat of white lithium grease on the gears, run around a little bit before taking the other half of the transmission case, sliding it over, then screwing in the 5 screws that are going to hold it together. Going to be 2 up here and then 3 down here. Once you have that done, you can also put down a piece of tape to cover up this bottom hole. With the transmission together, we can now take our drive shafts and slide them on to the output shafts. When they're both in place, we should be able to take the single grub screw that holds both of them in place and screw them in to the one hole on each drive shaft. Now it's time to reassemble the slipper clutch. First, you're going to take the little rod that you removed before and carefully slide it back in place, making sure you don't let it go and drop it and lose it. This is a very important piece, even though it's very small. With that in place, we're going to now take the back, slide it in place just like that. It should fall right into place. We're going to take the disc, position it in there just like that. I'm going to take the spur gear and slipper pad assembly. Then we're going to need to put this adjustable spring on, and then finally a single nut to top it off. When screwing down the nut on the slipper clutch, I find it easy to take the drive shafts, put them in this position, and hold them down with your hand while you tighten the nut with the other. Normally, after disassembling the slipper clutch, I tend to tighten the nut as far as I can go and then back it out 2 full turns. Then after that, you just adjust as necessary when the RC is running. Now we can take our motor, slide it into place just like that. Then we're going to rotate till we can find both screw holes in the top and bottom, just like that. Then we're going to screw in the 2 screws that hold it in place. Just remember not to tighten them down all the way. With the motor in place, we can now take our pinion gear and slide it onto the motor. Just want to make sure the grub screw is facing the end of the spindle with the flat edge. Once it's done, we just want to make it even with the spur gear. That looks about good. And then we're going to want to make sure to gear it properly, which that should actually be pretty close. You just want to, that looks about good right about there. So then I'll just screw down the 2 screws that hold the motor in place, as well as just make sure that the grub screw is tight. With everything tightened down, we can now take our gear cover, slide it over, and then screw in the 1 screw that holds it down right here. Now we're ready to put the wheel bar back onto the transmission. That's easily done by sliding into place, just like that, and screwing in the 5 screws that hold it on. There's going to be 3 on this side, and then 2 on this side. When I go in to put the screw for this piece right here, I'm going to be putting the screw in on this end, and putting a nut on the other side. Now we can take the remainder of the rear suspension, put it on over, attach both drive shafts. All they do is just slide into place, so it should be no problem at all. And then when those are attached, you can just take the A-arms, slide them into their place, and put in the 1 kingpin that holds them on. Now it's time to rebuild the shocks. First what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the little blue seals, slide them in place, making sure to put the little black spacer on in between both seals. Just like that. And I'm going to take our piston right here, slide it into place, just like that, making sure the rod goes through the seals, push it down, then take the bottom piece of the shock, slide it in place, and screw it on. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a cloth, put it on over, making sure the threaded end is still exposed. Take my needle nose pliers, slide it on over just like that, hold it down, and then screw on the rod end. Now comes my favorite part, filling in the shocks. So what you want to do is you want to take your oil. I'll display what kind of weight I am using in both front and rears down below. You're going to want to fill it about halfway. You're going to want to push the piston up and down a little bit, just slide it along, just to help get some of the bubbles out from underneath the piston head. It's going to take a little bit, so you might as well let it sit somewhere. If you have a stand, then you can use that. If not, you can just hold it here, listen to music like what I do. But when you are ready and you feel like enough bubbles have gone, you can go ahead and top it off. And you just want to make sure that there's still no bubbles underneath. So once you have it filled all the way to the top, you can just let it sit for a little bit longer. Sometimes I like to ride the piston all the way up and down while spinning it, just to make sure there is no more trapped bubbles underneath the piston. And you will just have it ride a lot smoother after doing so. While we wait for the bubbles to rise to the surface of the oil, we can take our shock cap and insert the bladder. All we really got to do is slide it into place, and you just got to work at it until it gets in there all the way. I like to take a screwdriver and just ride it along the surface of the body, just so that the bladder sits perfectly in the shock cap. Once all the air bubbles are out, we can now take our cap with the bladder inside and the shock itself, and we're just going to quickly and carefully slide it on over and just barely screw it into place. Once we know the cap has gotten on there, it's being a little tricky at the moment, just because I might have overfilled it a little bit, but once we know that's threaded a bit, what we're going to do is actually push down on the piston just about halfway through, and then we're going to finish off on unscrewing it and just release it. What we're doing right there is just making sure we have a proper seal around the bladder and that we have no air bubbles on the inside. Once you're done, you'll see it's coated with the oil. You're just going to want to clean it off with the cloth. And then once you press down on the piston, normally you should see it retract all the way through. But since I did not fill it enough and most of it escaped, it's not pushing back. So give me a moment, I will open it back up and do it properly. You'll know you rebuilt the shocks properly is if you can take the end of the rod, push it down all the way, and release it, and it should rebound. If you can get it to rebound all the way, you get better performance out of your shock. You can also go ahead and take both sides of the shocks, and you can push both of them down and release them at the same time, and as if they both extend at about the same rate, then you should be good. You can also go ahead and try and get them to extend them up the same amount, and you'll get better performance out of them. But as if you really want to be finicky with that, you don't have to do that, but you can. But as you guys can see, the difference in the properly rebuilt shock and one that was just kind of thrown together. One rebounds, the other does not. Once you're ready, it's time to put the last of the parts onto the shock. First, we'll take our top retainer, slide it in place. Then we're going to take our shock spring, slide it on, compress it a little bit, and then we're going to take our bottom retainer, slide it on, push it up, and we can release the spring. Now if you have any spacers on there, all you have to do is compress the spring a little bit and just slide them in place. If not, you are ready to go. With all the shocks assembled, we can now install them onto the RC. For the rear suspension, you're going to need the long ones, which are these guys right here. All you need to do is take a shoulder screw, put it through the top of the shock tower, then put a smaller screw through the hollow ball at the end of the shock, and just screw it into one of the 3 holes in the A-arms. For the fronts, you're going to need the shorter ones, and it's about the same thing, a shoulder screw through the top, but you're also going to need to put the rear of the shock into this little groove down here in the A-arm, and it's held on with a screw that goes to the very front. Now that I have both front and rear suspension assembled, we can now move on to the steering system. I have all pieces to both the bell cranks and the servo saver right in front of me, so we're just going to do a quick prep work before we move on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a screw, thread it through this hole right here, thread it through this hole right here, as well as a hole in the servo saver. This way I can just put nuts on the end and not have to worry about holding anything in place. Now we can take our center link for the bell cranks and we can insert the 2 shoulder screws that hold it into place. Once we have these in place, we can take it and screw them down into the both halves of the bell cranks in both holes. After that, we can take our servo link, slide it onto the servo saver, put a nut on the other end of the screw here, and then we can take another screw and screw it down right here on this arm of the bell crank. Now we can take the 4 bushings, slide them into place, just like that. Depending on if you guys have gotten any type of ball bearings or metal bushings. If you guys didn't, most likely these will be plastic for you, but these are brass for me. With the bell cranks all set, we can now move on to installing them onto the upper deck. First we'll need to put down 2 Teflon washers, 1 on each post. Then we can take the bell cranks themselves, slide them into place, just like that. I'm going to take another 2 Teflon washers, Just go right on the top. Just like that. Then we can take a small screw with a metal washer on top that look like this, then screw them down on both sides. With the bell cranks attached to the upper deck, we can now take the front toe links and just slide them on to the 2 screws that I put on the ends of each bell crank. All we have to do now is put a nut on the end and it should be good to go, and it's the same for the other side. With the toe links attached to the bell cranks, we can now take the bottom of the chassis and screw in the 3 screws that hold it to the bottom of the bulkhead. Now it's time to attach the upper deck to the chassis. That's easy but done by taking the upper deck and sliding it into place. You just want to be sure that the wire for the servo does not get kinked or caught on anything. It's easily avoided just by forcing it to go underneath the servo. After that, all you have to do is just slide it into place, press down on top of the bell cranks, and that should have the cap screws sink into the chassis. After that, all you have to do is screw in the 4 screws that hold it into place. Now that we have the front suspension in place, we can now take the rear suspension and do the same thing. For the rear suspension, what we've got to do is take the transmission, slide it into place, just like that. We're going to take the shock tower, push it all the way down, and screw in the 4 screws that hold it in place, as well as the 6 screws that hold the bottom of the transmission in place. Next, we can take the receiver box, slide it into place on the chassis, then screw in the 2 screws that hold it in place. Next, we can take the ESC plate and put it onto the chassis like so, and screw in the 4 screws that hold it into place. Now that we have the ESC plate where it belongs, we can now take the ESC, slide it into place, and screw in the 2 screws that hold it on. Now that majority of the RC is put back together, we can go back and put some of the smaller details into place, such as plugging in the motor, which is easily done by taking the wires, feeding them through the shock tower, and plugging them into the motor. That way we actually can move when we turn this thing on. Another thing is for the battery tie down, which is what I'm going to do is easily just take the little metal tie down with a clip on there, like so it's like a flywheel nut, and screw it down in place by hand, just like so. Also, I'll be going over and putting in a new antenna tube, because all my previous antenna tubes have been destroyed for Drogan here during clips. But since I'm out of orange, I'm going to be using a red one. So when I do this, I'm actually going to be adding some heat from a lighter so I can bend the antenna tube at a nice curve so that it can fit underneath the body, so I don't have to have the antenna sticking out all the way, which will be very nice. All that's left that I have to do is to center the servo. That's easily done by turning on the transmitter and the ESC. You should hear the servo move, and then when that's done, you can line up the tires so they're perfectly straight. And then when you're ready, just take the servo saver, slide it onto the servo, just like that, and then use the 1 screw that holds it into place. Here is before. And here is after, guys. As you guys can see, Drogan is looking awesome. Definitely dyeing everything does make this RC look phenomenal. Even though there's not that much other color on them besides the white, the blue, the orange, and the red from the wiring and the new antenna tube, which, as you guys can see, I did a nice little bend for when I put the body on. It doesn't stick out, which is going to be very nice, especially with crashes, because then I won't have to worry about changing the antenna anymore. But yeah, guys, I gotta say, this RC is looking awesome. Unfortunately, the bell cranks and servo saver did not come out as nice as I wanted them to, but it still gives them a nice, cool little effect. So I'm overall happy with how they turned out. But yeah, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you all next time. And that was Drogan's Level 5 upgrade.